And you can see the curve of the unemployment on this slide especially. This is the European community between 1960 and 1944. This is the US, this is the northern countries, and this is Japan. Next slide. About 2,400 million of the total population in the world, and 58% of the population aged 10 or more comprise the world workforce. If informal work and work at home is taken into consideration, the proportion of the working population is even higher. 75% workers live and work in developing countries, and about 25% in the industrialized world. For long, under the influence of mechanistic concepts of medicine, health was defined from its negative elements: illness, incapacity of death. WHO at the end of the Second World War imposed an approach which has been accepted everywhere in the world. They have defined health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. More complex, but surely more efficient, the concept of health, defined as a result of a permanent adaptation to the environment, ways of life and work, has been complemented by the notion of ability to involve oneself in the happiest possible way in the physical and human environment, which is the one of the community where people live. More than the absence of detectable disease or disability, this supposes satisfaction of fundamental needs which, beyond the various representations of health, different according to the times, places, and cultures, are the same for everybody: nutritional, educational, sanitary, affective needs, and regarding life at the workplace, safety, comfort, possibility of personal blooming, work being to be indisputably considered as a determining element in the building of one's own health. It is in a global prospect, and only in this one, that it would be suitable to speak of the workers' state of health in the world. But study means would be needed in the field of health, psychology, anthropology, and sociology, which are today unavailable on a large and comparative scale. So we will have to do with only some classical indexes and confirm some great trends. The first aspect concerns life expectancy, aging, and handicap. Next slide. In some industrialized countries, mortality statistics clearly show differences in life expectation according to the socio-professional categories. Thus, in France, the life expectancy at 35 varied in 1984 from 43.2 years to 34.3 according to you were professor or an unskilled worker. Ever since this difference has increased. It is highly probable that if such surveys were carried out, such differences might be observable in a great number of countries, despite to the fact that it is globally noted an increasingly general life expectancy. On a worldwide level, even if it is impossible to homogeneously individualize the social-professional categories, great differences can be observed in the various regions. For the gap is from more than 80 years old in Japan for female to 45 in Sierra Leone, which is the poorest country regarding this criteria. Next slide. A useful index for the comprehension of these various tables is used in the 1993 report of the World Bank on World Development. It shows the weight of morbidity among a population by a coefficient giving the number of years of life corrected with the disability factor. So there are again huge difference between the OECD country, which an index of 117, in Latin America, which is 232 in the average, and Sub-Saharan Africa with an index of 574. The correlation with life expectancy, health expenses, and gross national product is very strong. Among the predominant demographic trends is aging of the populations. Workers more than 60 count for 5.4% in industrialized countries and 5% in developing countries. Workers more than 50 count for 16.2 in industrialized countries and 15 in developing countries. In some industrialized countries, aging of the workforce and the simultaneous negative or zero growth in the population will lead to over-representation of the elderly and under-representation of the young, while it is foreseen that even in many developing countries, a more rapid aging will also be happening after the year 2000. Considering that after 45 years old, most of the workers have 1 to 3 physical or psychic deficiencies, the percentage of handicapped workers is going to increase dramatically, all the more that to the aging phenomenons are added disabilities due to work injuries or traffic accident, occupational diseases, and other life events. When considering that all jobs are usually designed according to the working capacity of supposed healthy young workers, this phenomenon will lead to an increasing percentage of workers excluded from their job. If in some developed countries, national policies of integration and rehabilitation of handicapped people are widely developed, in France, any firm counting more than 20 salaried people must employ at least 6% of disabled people. It is established that the double pressure of productivity and unemployment strongly impedes the application of these policies. In most of the countries, neither such laws exist nor vocational rehabilitation organisms, or there are very few. This leads to a major cause of inequality. Generally, work injuries are the more visible occupational health index. According to recent estimates by the ILO, there are some 120 million occupational accidents each year, involving some 210,000 fatalities and leading to 12 million permanent disabilities. That means that during the course of this Congress, about 1.3 million accidents will have occurred, leading to the loss of 2,300 lives. This slide, which is promised by Luis Carlos Morone and his colleagues, in their survey on occupational health in Brazil, compared the data in Brazil with other from developing and industrialized countries. And you can see the number of work accidents, which is in thousands, 592 in Brazil compared to 1,200 in Canada, 3,100 in US, and 1.2 in Nigeria. Everybody knows, and this is very demonstrating, that such figures are largely underestimated, and that it is sometimes difficult to compare with different countries. When I visited Vietnam last year, evidence came to me that no official report did exist, and even the meaning of work injury was different from what we are used to. Work injury means for them accident leading to fatality or to very severe impairment only. In Greece, for example, the data from the Social Insurance Institute differ strongly from those coming from the labor inspection, from 37,000 to 9,300 for the latter in the year 1986. Moreover, these data concern the salaried population having a social covering only. They do not take into account the accidents among the non-salaried people or self-employed, who in some countries represent the greatest percentage of the active population, mainly in the field of agriculture. And contrarily to the other workers, they have no system of compensation. The example of Benin in Africa is very significant. The active population is 2 million inhabitants. The coverage by the social insurance is 63,000 people. The number of work injuries is 1,000. This is from our colleague Fayomi between the year 85 and 89. Generally, the accidents involves among these workers the definite loss of their work ability. The consequences are all the more heavy than that it is in this sector. The worker, man or woman, is often the only source of income of the family. The fall of the ex-countries of the communist systems had led to the degradation of the social covering for many categories of workers, throwing them into the same situation as the one of the less developed country. Finally, the data rarely concern the after effects of these accidents, which are all the more severe that the access to cares differs very greatly from a country to another. The differences between the countries are considerable, and you can see in the green the highest rate of medical services compared to the middle rate and to the very poor rate in some part of Africa. Workers in these countries and workers belonging to the inorganized sector are one more time much more disadvantageous. Similar remarks can be done regarding occupational diseases. The estimated number is between 68 to 157 million new cases per year in the world. 30 to 40% of them may lead to chronic disease, and about 10% to permanent work disability, maybe 0.5 to 1% to death. As indicated by WHO, it is necessary to take into account also the incalculable number of work-related diseases. As previously, there is an imprecision in the figures due to the same reason. On this slide, you can see that Sweden has a ratio of occupational diseases much higher than it was in the USSR. which cannot be believed, of course, and which is due to the better way of of the method of diagnosis in Sweden than it was in USSR. If we take the threshold limit values, is the same remark can be done, and everybody knows that in the US the values were higher than in the USSR, but the experience of those who studied the reality in USSR before and after the perestroika showed that it was not at all the reflect of the reality. What is differentiating the most industrialized countries from the others is the increase mentioned in many surveys rather than in official data of mental disorders bound to the new organization of work, of stress due to the use of new technologies, time pressure, which characterize fierce competition, and above all, employment precariousness. This last phenomenon has been new for some years, both in developed countries and countries belonging to the ex-communist bloc, where employment was guaranteed lifetime. It constitutes for the workers having started their professional careers in the 50s a great factor of destabilization, whilst this situation has always been lasting in the third world economies. Nevertheless, there is a clear tendency among workers in newly industrialized countries to develop such stress-related mental disorders. In developing and newly industrialized countries, exposure to high level of chemical and dust, heavy physical work, heat stress are still the common figure, and there is often an aggravating factor due to poor nutrition and sanitary conditions, high prevalence of infectious diseases, general poverty and illiteracy. In these countries, due to historical consideration, precarity is unfortunately the common rule, but certainly has not the same consequences on mental attitude toward unemployment. As to occupational diseases, let us point a single example. Regarding chemicals, the case of pesticide poisoning is usually given as an example of the observed differences. On this slide, we can see the influence of climate on workers' exposures. This study was made by the French agronomist Alain Wissner in Brazil. In market garden farms, farming is carried out throughout the year, leading to permanent exposure, whilst the same factories, the same farms in France, due to a shorter warm season, exposure lasts 4 months only. Second, the type of pesticides differ according to the region they are used. In the 80s in India, 70% of the consumed pesticides, such as aldrin, chlordane, heptachlor, were either banned or strictly restricted in Western countries. Although safe chemical pesticides are now manufactured, it is not yet clear whether their use is widely shared out, especially in developing countries. A survey published in 1989 showed the prevalence of a high annual incidence of cases of pesticide poisoning in some countries of Africa, where about 80% of the labor force work in agriculture. This was confirmed in Sri Lanka by Jayartnam, who considers pesticides as one of the major health problems in the third world. A lot of other examples could be shown, making stand out the differences and similarities between industrialized countries and others. According to the recently published document WHO Global Strategy on Occupational Health for All, 10 to 30% of the workers are exposed to physical factors in the industrial world, while the rate is up to 80% in the developing and newly industrialized world. 10 to 30% of the workforce are exposed to heavy physical workload in the industrialized world, while the rate is between 50 and 70% in the developing world. Musculoskeletal disorders are becoming one of the most prevalent occupational health problems in most of the countries. And this is the figure in France according to the data of the Social Security regarding the compensated cases. You can see the curve between 1972 to 1992. 300 to 350 different factors have been identified as occupational carcinogens, and other to 300 as having adverse effects on reproduction. 3,000 allergenic factors, most of them existing in the work environment, explain the growing tendency of the population to develop an allergic response. Silica, asbestos, coal dust are still present in large quantities in many workplaces, mainly in the developing world. 4 million, about almost 5 million of cases of silicosis has been described in China between 1949 and 1992. 200 biological agents, viruses, bacteria, parasites, fungi, molds, and organic dusts have been found to occur in occupational exposures. While immunization programs in the workplace are widely undertaken in Western countries, surgeons and nurses operate patients with AIDS without any personal protective equipment, even gloves, in Africa operating theater, where the prevalence of seropositivity is up to 40%. That list is not ended. It is easy to understand that the effects of these occupational hazards on health depend on the condition of work, which themselves closely depend on the law and regulation of every country, on the way their implementation is controlled, and on the availability of occupational health services. Unfortunately, the current figure is that only 20 to 50% of the workers in industrialized countries and less than 10% in developing countries have access to such services. So, even in Southeast Asia, where you have seen development is the most noticeable, the situation is far from being satisfactory. We can see that in small-size industry manufacturing lead and metal in Asia, the availability of on-site physician is very poor, and on outside doctor is not so bad, but many countries have no services at all. In addition, the health effects depend on the possibilities of access to care, both technical and financial, and we saw in the previous slide the state of inequity of care access. This short overview showed us some differences and similarities which oppose both the industrialized world and the developing world, but which also oppose different categories of workers within each country, leading to the concept of equity in occupational health. What is certain and must be constantly repeated is that the majority of the occupational hazards effects can be prevented, mainly because they are due to process, organization, and tools which are invented and designed by men and do not come from some invisible hand. That the human and economical benefit expected thanks to prevention is considerable, whatever may be the developing level of the country, the healthy and productive worker is a key person for any organization aiming at producing materials, goods, or services. From now on, there is a race at a worldwide and never-reached level between the forces acting in favor of industry and trade development without establishing the respect of man's health and environment as an indissociable condition to this development, and those who, on the contrary, plead in favor of this condition. In France, after 1789 revolution, the Assemblée Constituante proclaimed the freedom of work without any limit. This liberalism trend was followed in Europe and was the starter of the Industrial Revolution, source of many benefits, but also on a continental scale, source of considerable human and environmental damages. The Uruguay round negotiation has just been finished, leading to the establishment of the World Trade Organization, putting forward on a worldwide scale the same principle of liberalism without any limit. A century was nearly needed 200 years ago before implementing efficient policies and strategies of prevention in the field of occupational health. Today, the stake concerns all the planet. The technology of prevention, that is to say the knowledge and the way to apply it, exists, and the professional in occupational health, we own them. Today and in the near future, they have to play a considerable part, effort essentially based on research, adapted to the condition of the presently developing countries or in redeployment, such as ex-USSR and East European countries. On implementation and evaluation of the strategies of prevention, on information and education of workers and employers, information of the public opinion, preparing the decision makers to adopt the legislative and technical principle of prevention. This is our personal responsibility wherever we are. It is also our collective responsibility when we meet, as on the opportunity of this Congress or within the International Commission on Occupational Health. It is also the one of the official international bodies, ILO and WHO, with which we work together. Without any doubt, it is a great privilege for us to intimately participate in what is today one of the most important world stakes to make development be the genuine source of improvement of mankind life on Earth. Thank you for your attention.
I am very honored to be invited to your Congress here in Brazil, and this by my friend and Dr. Rudy Facci. May I introduce first myself? As you can see, my name is Hertogen. I am a physician in occupational health in Belgium, and I am working in this position since '73 for Volvo cars in Belgium, where we are producing, as you may know, the 850. Now I want to introduce our chairman, Mr. Rudy Facci, which is a specialist in occupational health, president of the National Association of Brazil, and the head of the Department of Occupational Health of Volvo do Brasil. And second, Professor Jerry Adnam, which is head of the Division of Occupational Medicine, University of Singapore, Director of the World Health Organization, Collaborating Center for Occupational